Good morning everybody, this is Stephen Pugh of the Home Bible College. I want to do a book review again today. It's Sunday the 29th of January 2017 and we're going to do a book review today on the NIV Bible, the New International Version Bible. Now we've done the Authorized Version, the King James Version. We've also done the Revised Standard Version. And we're now looking at the NIV Bible, and my basis for my book review is going to be the preface to the NIV Bible, which should be found at the beginning of all copies of the NIV. What the translators thought and wrote about their own translation is, I think, the fairest way to have a book review. Now, the New International Version was a completely new translation of the Holy Bible, made by over 100 scholars, working directly from the best available Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek texts. It had its beginning in 1965, when several years of exploratory study by committees from the Christian Reformed Church and the National Association of Evangelicals, a group of scholars which met at Palos Heights in Illinois, and concurred in the need for a new translation of the Bible in contemporary English. Now, this group, though not made up of official church representatives, was nevertheless trans-denominational. It included people from all Christian denominations. Its conclusion was endorsed by a large number of leaders from many denominations who met in Chicago in 1966. Responsibility for the new version was delegated by the Palos Heights group to a self-governing body of 15. The Committee on Bible Translation, composed for the most part Bible scholars from colleges, universities and seminaries. In 1969, the New York Bible Society, which is now called the International Bible Society, generously undertook the financial sponsorship for the project, sponsorship that made it possible to enlist the help of many distinguished scholars. The fact that participants from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia and New Zealand worked together gave the project its international scope. That they were from many denominations, including Anglican, Assemblies of God, Baptist, Brethren, Christian Reformed, Church of Christ, Evangelical Free, Lutheran, Mennonite, Methodist, Nazarene, Presbyterian, Wesleyan and other churches helped to safeguard the translation from sectarian bias. This is not a translation based upon any one Christian denomination. All Christian denominations were drawn into this project. How it was made helps to give the New International Version its distinctiveness. The translation of each book was assigned to a team of scholars, and next one of the intermediate editorial committees revised the initial translation with constant reference to the Hebrew, Aramaic or Greek. Their work went on to one of the general editorial committees, who checked in detail and made another thorough version. This revision in turn was carefully reviewed by the Committee on Bible Translation, which made further changes and then released the final version for publication. In this way, the entire Bible went through 3 complete revisions by all these scholars, during each of which the translation was examined for its faithfulness to the original languages and for its English style. Now, all of this involved many thousands of hours of research and discussion regarding the meaning of the text and the precise way of putting them into English. It may well be that no other translation has been made by a more thorough process of review and revision from committee to committee than this one. So this places the NIV at quite a high level of quality compared with many translations. Some translations have been produced by one single person, or maybe just a few people, but this was a translation produced by a lot of people working together, but at 3 complete separate revisions before the final text was established. So from the beginning of the project, the Committee on Bible Translation held to certain goals for the New International Version. It would be an accurate translation, and one which would have clarity and literary quality, and so prove suitable for public and private reading, for teaching, preaching, memorizing, and liturgical use. The committee also sought to preserve some measure of continuity with the long tradition of translating the scriptures into English. In working towards these goals, the translators were united in their commitment to the authority and the infallibility of the Bible as God's Word in written form. They believe that it contains the divine answer to the deepest needs of humanity, and that it sheds light on our path in a dark world, and that it sets forth the way to our eternal well-being. The first concern of the translators has been the accuracy of the translation and its fidelity to the thought of the biblical writers. They have weighed the significance of the lexical and grammatical details of the Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek texts. At the same time, they have striven for more than a word-for-word translation, because thought patterns and syntax differ from language to language. Faithful communication of the meaning of the writers of the Bible demands frequent modifications in sentence structure and constant regard to the contextual meaning of words. Now, what this means is this, is that if we translate merely word for word from one word to another word, then what happens then is that sometimes the actual meaning of the sentence is not really conveyed on a word-by-word basis. We need to remember that we don't speak in English today in the same sort of sentence construction as the way in which Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek texts were written. The order of words in our sentences is in a different tradition. But the other thing to remember is that very often there are idioms, there are expressions of speech, hundreds, thousands of expressions of speech, which if they're translated word by word can mean nothing to the modern reader, because they need to be partially explained by the translator. The work of the translator is not just to translate a word for another word. The work of the translator is to be able to convey the meaning in the words. So let's read on. A sensitive feeling for the style does not always accompany scholarship. Accordingly, the Committee on Bible Translation submitted the developing version to a number of stylistic consultants. 2 of them read every book of both the Old and New Testament twice, once before and once after the last major revision, and made invaluable suggestions. Samples of the translations were tested for clarity and ease of reading by various types of people, young and old, highly educated and less well educated, ministers and laymen. So it wasn't just about the translation alone, it was about its readability, its ability to be read by the educated and by the less educated, by the young and by the old. So the concern for clear and natural English, and that the New International Version should be idiomatic but not idiosyncratic, contemporary but not dated, motivated the translators and the consultants. At the same time, they tried to reflect the differing styles of the biblical writer. In view of the international use of English, the translators sought to avoid obvious Americanisms on the one hand and obvious Anglicisms on the other. A British edition reflects the contemporary few differences of significant idiom and spelling. Now, people may not know that America and Great Britain and some of the other English-speaking countries like Canada and Australia, New Zealand, we are separated, we are divided by the same language. We have different spellings, we have different ways of saying things. And so it was very important to produce two different versions of this New International Version, which would have American spellings and idioms in one, and English, British Anglicanisms in the other. As for the traditional pronouns thou, thee, thine, in reference to the deity, the translators judged that to use the archaisms along with the old verbs such as doest, wouldest, hadst, would violate accuracy of translation. Neither Hebrew, Aramaic or Greek uses special pronouns for the persons of the Godhead. A present-day translation is not enhanced by forms that in the time of the King James Version were in everyday speech, whether they're referring to God or to man. For the Old Testament, the standard Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, was published in the latest editions of the Biblica Hebranica. It was used throughout, and the Dead Sea Scrolls contain material bearing on an earlier stage of the Hebrew text, and they were consulted, as were the Samaritan Pentateuch and the ancient scribal traditions relating to textual changes. Sometimes a variant Hebrew reading in the margin of the Masoretic text was followed instead of the normal text itself. Such instances, being variant within the Masoretic text, are not specified by footnotes. In rare cases, words in the consonant text are divided differently from the way that they appear in the Masoretic text, and footnotes include this. The translators also consulted the more important early versions, the Septuagint, Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion, the Vulgate, the Syrian Peshitta, the Targums, and for the Psalms, the Juxtahebraka of Jerome. Reading from these versions was occasionally followed where the Masoretic text seemed doubtful, and where accepted principles of textual criticism showed that one or more of these textual witnesses appeared to provide the correct meaning, the correct reading. Such instances are footnoted. Sometimes vowel letters and vowel signs did not, in the judgment of the translators, represent the correct vowels for the original consonant text. Accordingly, some words were read with a different set of vowels. These instances are usually not indicated by footnotes. Now, the Greek text used in translating the New Testament was an eclectic one. No other piece of ancient literature has had such an abundance of manuscript witnesses as does the New Testament. Where existing manuscripts differ, the translators made their choice of readings according to the accepted principles of New Testament textual criticism. Footnotes call attention to places where there was uncertainty about what the original text said, and the best current printed texts of the New Testament, of the Greek New Testaments, were used. There is a sense in which the work of translation is never wholly finished, and this applies to all great literature and uniquely so to the Bible. In 1973, the New Testament in the New International Version was published. Since then, suggestions for corrections and revisions have been received from various sources. The Committee on Bible Translation carefully considered these suggestions and adopted a number of them, and these are incorporated in the first printing of the entire Bible. As in other ancient documents, the precise meaning of the biblical text is something uncertain. This is more often the case with the Hebrew and the Aramaic texts than with the Greek text. Although archaeological and linguistic discoveries in the century aid our understanding of difficult passages, some uncertainties still remain in parts. The more significant of these has been called to the reader's attention in the footnotes. Now, in regard to the divine name Yahweh, commonly referred to as the Tetragrammaton, the translators adopted the device used in modern English versions of rendering the name as Lord in capital letters to distinguish it from Adonai, another Hebrew word rendered Lord, for which small letters are used. Whenever the two names stand together in the Old Testament as a compound name for God, they are rendered Sovereign Lord. Because for both readers today the phrase the Lord of Hosts and the God of Hosts has little meaning, this version renders them as the Lord Almighty and God Almighty. These renderings convey the sense of the Hebrew, namely, He who is sovereign over all the hosts, that is the powers in heaven and earth, especially over the hosts, that is the armies of Israel. For readers unacquainted with Hebrew, this does not make clear the distinction between Sabaoth, the hosts or Almighty, and Shaddai, which can also be translated as Almighty. But the latter occurs infrequently and is always footnoted. When Adonai and Yahweh Sabaoth occur together, they are rendered the Lord Almighty. As for other proper nouns, the familiar spelling of the King James Version is generally retained. Names traditionally spelled with a CH, except where it is final, are usually spelled in this translation with a K or a C. Since the biblical languages do not have the sound CH, frequently indicates in English, for example in chant, for well-known names such as Zechariah. However, the traditional spelling has been retained. Variation in the spelling of names in the original languages has usually not been included. Where a person or place has two or more different names in the Hebrew, Aramaic or Greek text, the more familiar one has generally been used, with footnotes where it's needed. So to achieve clarity, the translators sometimes supplied words not in the original text, but required by the context. If there was uncertainty about such material, it was enclosed in brackets. Also, for the sake of clarity or style, nouns, including proper nouns, are sometimes substituted for pronouns and vice versa. And though Hebrew writers often shifted back and forth between first and second and third person pronouns without change of accentant, this translation often makes them uniform in accordance with English style and without the use of footnotes. Now, the poetical passages are printed as poetry, that is, with indentation of lines and with separate stanzas. These are generally designed to reflect the structure of Hebrew poetry. The poetry is normally characterized by parallelism in balanced lines. Most of the poetry in the Bible is in the Old Testament, and scholars differ regarding the scansion of Hebrew lines. The translators determined the stanza divisions for the most part by analysis of the subject matter. The stanzas therefore serve as poetic paragraphs. As an aid to the reader, italicized section headings are inserted in most of the books. These are not to be regarded as part of the NIV text, are not for oral reading, and are not intended to dictate the interpretation of the sections that they head. Now, this is the same in all Bibles. When in a particular Bible a little phrase is used to describe what the passage is about, those little phrases are put in by translators, or they're put in by Bible students to enable them to understand what the forthcoming passage will be about. But those little phrases are not part of the text of the Bible. Now, the footnotes of this version are of several kinds. most of which need no explanation. Those giving alternative translations begin with or, and generally introduce the alternative with the last word preceding it in the text, except when it is a single word alternative. In poetry, quoted in a footmark, a slant mark indicates a line division. Footnotes introduced by or do not have uniform significance. In some cases, two possible translations were considered to have about equal validity. In other cases, though the translators were convinced that the translation of the text was correct, they judged that another interpretation was possible or of sufficient importance to be presented in a footnote. In the New Testament, footnotes that refer to uncertainty regarding the original text are introduced by some manuscripts or similar expressions. In the Old Testament, evidence for the reading chosen is given first, and evidence for the alternative is added after a semicolon. For example, Septuagint, semicolon, Hebrew Father. In such notes, the term Hebrew refers to the Masoretic text. Now, it should be noted that minerals, flora and fauna, and architectural details, articles of clothing and jewellery, and musical instruments and other articles cannot always be identified with precision. Also, measures of capacity in the Bible period are particularly uncertain. See the tables of weights and measures following the text. And like all translations of the Bible made, they are by imperfect men. This one undoubtedly falls short of its goals, and yet we are grateful to God for the extent to which He has enabled us to realize these goals, and for the strength He has given us and our colleagues to complete our task. We offer this version to Him in whose name and for whose glory it has been made. We pray that it will lead many into a better understanding of the Holy Scriptures and a fuller knowledge of Jesus Christ, the incarnate Word, of whom the Scriptures so faithfully testify. So this preface was written by the Committee on Bible Translation, and it was completed in June 1978, and then it was revised in August 1983. So, what's my opinion of the translation? Well, it's a very difficult thing to be that critical, to be critical in a good way, to give one's own personal. I don't personally use the NIV very much, although I have used it in the past, and I've found it to be a fine and a good translation. I am old-fashioned, and in my Bible studies for the last 50 years, I've always used the authorized version, the authorized version of King James. But I do recognize that the King James version has lots of faults, lots of things about it, lots of idiosyncrasies and it is very ancient, it is very old. I have a copy of the original King James version, and it's unable to be read straight from the text, so revision is had to be necessary over the years. It's just something that's had to happen. This translation, the NIV, is a very good translation. The very best of scholarship has been used. They have had access to a great deal more of original manuscripts than pretty well any other translation in recent history. So I would commend it to people. I think it's a fine translation and something which we should accept willingly. On a note, the NIV Bible by far outstrips all other Bible translations. It just completely leaves all the other Bible translations standing in terms of numbers sold, and also its general acceptance by the general public. So there we are. That's my thoughts based on the preface of the Bible Translation Committee of the NIV, and I commend it to you. God bless you all. Bye for now.